Bitter and left with nothing but a rotting abandoned cabin, one woman watched her greedy ex-husband claim ultimate victory. He walked away with the cash, the cars, and his pride, completely unaware he had just handed her the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire hidden directly beneath the dusty floorboards. The air in the downtown Chicago arbitration room felt perfectly sterile, a sharp contrast to the messy, agonizing death of Nora Dempsey's 10-year marriage. Across the long mahogany table sat Simon Gallagher, her soon-to-be ex-husband, wearing a bespoke Italian suit and an expression of poorly concealed triumph. Beside him sat his aggressive corporate attorney, a man who had spent the last 8 months legally dissecting Nora's life until there was nothing left but scraps. Nora stared at the thick stack of settlement documents resting before her. Her own lawyer, Harrison Reed, a gentle but exhausted family law attorney, leaned in close. "Nora, you don't have to sign this," Harrison whispered, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "It's completely lopsided. He's draining the joint brokerage accounts. He's keeping the townhouse in Austin, the BMW, and the offshore investment portfolio. We can take this to trial. We can subpoena the Cayman accounts." Nora closed her eyes, the ambient hum of the fluorescent lights feeling like a drill against her skull. "With what money, Harrison?" she replied, her voice hollow. "Simon froze the primary accounts in February. He starved me out. He knows I can't afford another year of litigation. I just want it to be over." Simon leaned back in his leather chair, checking his Rolex, a gift Nora had bought him for their 5th anniversary. He was already planning his weekend getaway to Cabo with Valerie, his 24-year-old former personal assistant. "If we're quite finished with the whispering," Simon said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I have a flight to catch. The terms are generous, Nora. You get $40,000 in cash, your Subaru, and the Appalachian property. You always said you wanted a project." The Appalachian property? The words felt like a slap in the face. 5 years ago, during a brief period when Simon fancied himself a real estate mogul, he had purchased a deeply discounted 10-acre plot of land, sight unseen in the remote foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, near a forgotten town called Oakhaven. The property came with a dilapidated 90-year-old cabin. Simon had intended to bulldoze it and sell the land to a luxury resort developer, but the local zoning board firmly rejected the permits. Overnight, the land became a worthless, unsellable tax burden. Now Simon was using it as a pawn to make the asset division look slightly more equitable on paper. Nora picked up the heavy brass pen. Her hand trembled slightly, not from sadness, but from a profound, boiling rage. She had supported Simon through business school. She had worked double shifts at a local bakery to keep them afloat while he launched his logistics company. The moment the millions started rolling in, she was suddenly out of sync with his lifestyle. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name. Simon's smirk widened into a full grin. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and offered a dismissive nod to Harrison. "Pleasure doing business," he said, turning on his heel and walking out of the room, leaving the heavy glass door to swing shut behind him. 2 days later, Nora packed her entire remaining life into the back of her dented Subaru Outback. With the meager $40,000, most of which was already earmarked for Harrison's legal fees, she had no choice but to head east. The rental market in Chicago was entirely out of her reach, and her pride wouldn't allow her to crash on her friends' couches indefinitely. She had a roof in the mountains. It was her only option. The drive to Oakhaven took 14 hours. The closer she got, the more the modern world seemed to strip away, replaced by towering pines, winding asphalt, and heavy, low-hanging fog. When her GPS finally announced that she had arrived, Nora parked on a gravel shoulder and stared through the windshield. Her heart sank into her stomach. The cabin was worse than she had imagined. It sat at the end of a long, muddy driveway, half swallowed by aggressive kudzu vines and briar bushes. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, heavily patched with rusted corrugated tin. The front porch had partially collapsed, and the original log walls were stained dark with decades of moisture and rot. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a tomb. Nora stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tight against the biting autumn wind. The silence of the woods was deafening, broken only by the crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots. She carefully navigated the rotted steps and pushed open the front door, which protested with a loud metallic shriek. The inside smelled aggressively of mildew-wet wood and animal droppings. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light, filtering through the grime-caked windows. There was a rusted cast-iron stove in the center of the main room, a small kitchenette with a hand-pump sink and a narrow hallway, leading to a single bedroom and a primitive bathroom. Nora dropped her duffel bag onto the dusty floorboards. The sheer weight of her reality finally crushed the last of her defenses. She sank to her knees in the middle of the empty, freezing room, buried her face in her hands, and wept. She cried for the decade she had wasted for the betrayal, and for the terrifying, lonely abyss her life had become. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the cabin into a deep, heavy darkness, the tears eventually stopped. Nora wiped her face, her jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. Simon wanted her to break. He expected her to crawl back to the city destitute and defeated. "Not today," Nora whispered to the empty room. She retrieved a heavy-duty flashlight and a sleeping bag from her car, laid it out near the cast-iron stove, and prepared for her first night in the ruins. The first 3 weeks in Oakhaven were an exercise in brutal, back-breaking survival. Nora quickly learned that the $40,000 she had walked away with was vanishing at an alarming rate. After paying her lawyer, settling her lingering city debts, and buying essential survival supplies, a chainsaw, a portable generator, heavy winter clothing, and basic tools, she was down to less than $8,000. Driven by sheer unadulterated spite, Nora threw herself into repairing the cabin. From dawn until dusk, she worked until her hands were blistered and her muscles screamed. She tore out the rotting porch planks and replaced them with fresh lumber. She scrubbed the floors with bleach, chased out the families of raccoons living in the rafters, and patched the gaping holes in the tin roof using a ladder she bought second-hand from a local hardware store. During her trips into town, she learned a bit about the property's history from the elderly locals at the diner. The cabin, they told her, had originally belonged to a man named Wyatt Langdon, a notoriously paranoid industrialist who had lived there during the 1950s and 60s. Langdon was a recluse, deeply untrusting of banks and the government. He had died in the late 80s, leaving no heirs, and the property had languished in a bureaucratic limbo for decades before Simon scooped it up at a blind estate auction. Old Man Langdon was a strange bird. The hardware store owner, a gruff man named Bill, had told her while ringing up her roofing tar. Poured concrete all day, ordered steel by the ton. Folks thought he was building a bomb shelter, but nobody ever found one. Nora hadn't thought much of the story at the time. She was too focused on surviving the impending winter. By mid-November, the Appalachian weather turned violent. A massive storm system rolled over the mountains, bringing 3 days of relentless torrential rain. The ground quickly became saturated, turning the dirt driveway into a thick soup. On the third night of the storm, Nora awoke to a sound that made her blood run cold, a deep, rushing gurgle coming from beneath the floorboards. She threw off her heavy blankets, grabbed her flashlight, and rushed to the kitchen. The trapdoor that led down to the cabin's root cellar was visibly vibrating. She pulled it open, shining the beam down the rickety wooden stairs. The cellar, a cramped, earthen-walled square, used for storing preserves, was flooding rapidly. Muddy water was pouring in through a crack in the stone foundation, already calf-deep and rising. If the water reached the wooden support beams holding up the floor, the entire cabin could shift and collapse. Panicked, Nora threw on her heavy rubber boots and grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from her toolbox. She scrambled down the slippery steps into the freezing water. The cold bit through her jeans instantly. She waded toward the far corner where a rudimentary floor drain was supposed to be completely choked by years of compacted dirt and debris. She plunged the crowbar into the water, blindly stabbing at the mud to clear the drain. The water was rising faster now, swirling around her knees. Thud. The crowbar struck something hard. Not stone. Not concrete. It was a sharp, distinct metallic clang that reverberated through the iron bar and jarred her wrists. Nora paused, wiping rain and sweat from her forehead. She plunged the crowbar down again, scraping it laterally across the floor beneath the mud and water. Clang! Clang! The surface below was completely smooth. Desperation fueling her adrenaline, Nora dropped to her knees in the freezing water. She used her bare hands to frantically dig and sweep away the thick layer of mud and gravel. Her fingernails scraped against something cold and rigid. It was a heavy steel handle, recessed into a thick metal plate. The drain wasn't just a drain. It was a disguise. Ignoring the rising water, Nora jammed the hooked end of the crowbar under the recessed steel handle. She planted her boots firmly on the submerged concrete and threw her entire body weight backward. The metal groaned in protest, fused by decades of rust and dampness. "Come on," Nora screamed, her voice echoing in the small, flooded chamber. She leveraged the crowbar against the edge of the recess and pushed with every ounce of strength she had left. With a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot, the rust seal broke. The heavy steel plate shifted. Instantly, the floodwaters began rapidly swirling down into the dark rectangular void she had just exposed, draining the root cellar with the ferocity of a bathtub drain. Nora scrambled back against the dirt wall, panting heavily, watching the water vanish into the earth. Within 5 minutes, the cellar was empty, leaving behind only a thick coat of slippery mud. She crawled back to the opening and pointed her trembling flashlight downward. It wasn't a pipe. It was a shaft. Below the false floor of the root cellar, a solid concrete staircase descended into total pitch blackness. The air wafting up from the hole didn't smell like dirt or sewage. It smelled like dry, stale ozone and old paper. It was a completely waterproof, hermetically sealed environment. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Old Man Langdon's rumors weren't just local folklore. She gripped her flashlight tighter, the cold completely forgotten. Slowly, carefully, she swung her legs over the edge and placed her boot on the first concrete step. It was perfectly dry. She descended one step, then another. The shaft went down about 12 feet before opening up into a wider space. When Nora reached the bottom, her boots touched smooth, polished concrete. She raised the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkness. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. It was a subterranean vault, roughly the size of a 2-car garage. The walls were lined with thick steel plating, completely untouched by the dampness of the earth above. But it wasn't the engineering that made Nora drop to her knees. Stacked methodically along the far wall were dozens of olive-green military-grade steel crates. They were stacked 5 high, secured with heavy brass padlocks. On the left side of the room, sitting on a sturdy metal workbench, was a canvas tarp that had been hastily thrown over something bulky. Trembling, Nora walked toward the workbench. She pinched the dusty edge of the canvas tarp and pulled it back. Underneath sat 6 glass mason jars. But they weren't filled with preserves. They were packed to the brim with glittering, brilliant-cut stones, diamonds, sapphires, and rubies, catching the beam of her flashlight and fracturing the light into 1,000 dazzling colors against the steel walls. Beside the jars sat a heavy leather-bound ledger. Nora blew the dust off the cover and flipped it open. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten columns dating back to 1958. Asset transfer, Swiss reserve, $450,000, bearer bonds. Acquisition, 1933, Double Eagle Gold Reserve, 400 ounces, uncut diamond deposit, Antwerp Exchange. Nora stared at the ledger, the words blurring together. Simon had fought so ruthlessly for a meager $1 million portfolio, tossing her away like garbage to an unsellable piece of land. He had handed her a crumbling, rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere. He didn't know he had just handed her the bank. Nora looked back at the stacks of military crates. Her hands were shaking violently now, but a slow, profound smile began to spread across her muddy, tear-streaked face. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the state. And Simon Gallagher was going to deeply, deeply regret the day he let her keep the Miller tract. Nora Dempsey didn't sleep that night. She sat on the cold concrete floor of the subterranean vault, surrounded by the staggering reality of Wyatt Langdon's paranoia. The sheer volume of wealth contained within the military crates was incomprehensible. When she finally pried open one of the brass padlocks, using her heavy steel crowbar, she found it packed tight with rows of pristine, untouched gold bullion bars, each stamped with the seal of the Swiss National Bank. Another crate held vacuum-sealed stacks of Series EE savings bonds and immaculate uncirculated $100 bills from the 1970s. It was a dragon's hoard, forgotten by time and hidden from the modern world. But as the initial euphoria subsided, a cold, sharp realization washed over her. The money was a liability. If Simon found out about this discovery before she could legally launder and secure the assets, he would unleash his corporate attorneys to argue that the wealth was a marital asset hidden during the divorce proceedings. Even though the settlement was finalized, Simon's legal team could tie her up in aggressive litigation for decades. Furthermore, the IRS would have a field day with an unregistered hoard of gold and unregistered bearer bonds. She needed a bulletproof plan, and she needed an ally she could trust implicitly. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Nora climbed out of the vault, sealed the heavy steel plate, and drove until she reached a small diner near the interstate that had reliable cell service. She dialed Harrison Reed. When the lawyer answered, his voice was thick with sleep. Nora did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him everything. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by Harrison taking a deep, shaky breath. He immediately instructed her not to tell another soul, not to touch the banks, and to wait for him. He was boarding the next available flight to the regional airport. 2 days later, Harrison stood in the flooded root cellar, staring down into the illuminated vault. He was accompanied by an independent, discreet asset appraiser named Gregory Pierce, a man who specialized in estate liquidation for ultra-high net worth clients. Gregory spent 14 hours meticulously cataloging the contents of the vault. The final tally was staggering. Between the uncut diamonds, the pristine gold bullion, the bearer bonds, and the cash, the estimated value of the Langdon estate was quietly hovering around $48 million. Nora had to sit down on the concrete steps when she heard the exact number. "We have to move quietly," Harrison explained, adjusting his glasses in the dim light of the vault. "We will establish a blind trust immediately, the Oak Haven Heritage Trust. We will slowly introduce the assets into the legal financial system through international auction houses and private brokerage accounts. We will pay the necessary estate recovery taxes to keep the federal government perfectly happy. By the time the paperwork is filed, the money will be legally entirely yours. Simon's settlement explicitly waived his right to any future discoveries on this specific parcel of land. His arrogance in that arbitration room just cost him an absolute empire. For the next 4 months, Nora lived a highly calculated double life. To the locals in the town, she was still the struggling divorcee, fixing up the rotting cabin. But behind the scenes, heavily armored Brinks trucks made dead-of-night visits to the property, slowly transporting the gold and gems to a private high-security depository in Atlanta. Nora worked closely with Harrison to legally claim the abandoned assets under specific archaic state salvage and abandoned property laws, paying millions in taxes to ensure her new wealth was completely untouchable. The legal fortress they built was impenetrable. However, the universe has a funny way of testing a perfect plan. Just as the final transfer of funds cleared into the Oakhaven Heritage Trust, a certified letter arrived at the cabin. It was from Simon's legal firm. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs as she tore open the envelope. Simon was demanding a renegotiation of the property boundaries. His logistics company had recently suffered a massive financial hit due to a failed expansion into the South American market. Desperate for liquidity, Simon had discovered that the timber rights on the 10-acre Appalachian property were potentially worth a couple of $100,000 to a commercial logging corporation. Because the divorce settlement had been hastily drafted by his own aggressive team, there was a minor clerical ambiguity regarding the mineral and timber rights. Simon, arrogant and desperate, was threatening to file an injunction to halt any activity on the land and force a forced sale of the timber, claiming he was still a partial stakeholder in the natural resources. He assumed Nora was still destitute, starving, and incapable of fighting him in court. He assumed she would just roll over and accept a tiny percentage of the timber sale just to survive the harsh mountain winter. He had no idea that he was no longer fighting a desperate, abandoned housewife. He was picking a fight with the CEO of a $48 million war chest. Nora smiled, a cold, dangerous smile that didn't reach her eyes. She picked up her phone and called Harrison. "Let him sue," she said, her voice dripping with venomous anticipation. "In fact, encourage him. Let him drain whatever liquid cash he has left on legal fees. And when he's completely exhausted his resources, we are going to invite him down here for a little chat." The legal battle over the timber rights dragged on for 6 grueling months. Simon, fueled by a toxic mixture of desperation and ego, poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into his attorneys, attempting to bleed Nora dry. He expected her to default on the legal responses. Instead, Harrison Reed met every single motion with a brutal, flawlessly executed counterfiling. Simon's lawyers were completely baffled. They couldn't understand how Nora Dempsey, a woman they had left with $40,000 and a rotting cabin, was retaining a Tier 1 litigation team that was systematically dismantling their arguments in federal court. By the time the autumn leaves began to turn again, exactly 1 year after Nora had first arrived in Oakhaven, Simon's financial world was entirely collapsing. His young girlfriend, Valerie, had abruptly left him when the luxury sports cars were repossessed by the bank. His logistics company was actively filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The offshore accounts he had so carefully hidden during the divorce had been seized by international creditors. Facing total ruin, Simon decided to make a desperate, unannounced trip to the Appalachian property. He planned to physically intimidate Nora into signing over a quitclaim deed, hoping he could quickly sell the land and avoid total financial annihilation. Simon drove a rented baseline sedan up the winding mountain roads, his customized Italian suit looking rumpled and stained. He expected to find the same miserable, collapsing structure he had dumped on his ex-wife. He expected to find her broken, weeping, and ready to surrender. But as he turned onto the property, his jaw slackened. The mud-choked, overgrown driveway was gone. In its place was a pristine, winding stretch of crushed black gravel, flanked by manicured native landscaping and expensive stone retaining walls. At the end of the drive, the rotting cabin had been completely transformed. It was no longer a shack. It was a stunning architectural masterpiece, a sprawling, modern, rustic mountain estate featuring massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, rich cedar siding, and a heavy slate roof. A brand-new top-of-the-line Range Rover was parked gracefully in the circular driveway. Simon parked his rented sedan, stepping out into the crisp mountain air. His mind violently rejected what his eyes were seeing. This was a multi-million-dollar renovation. It was impossible. He stumbled up the wide, heated stone steps and aggressively rang the heavy brass doorbell. The heavy oak door swung open. Nora stood in the grand foyer. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly serene. She wore a tailored cashmere sweater and dark designer jeans. Around her neck rested a simple, breathtaking necklace featuring a flawless, uncut sapphire, a small, sparkling souvenir from Old Man Langdon's vault. "Hello, Simon." Nora said, her tone perfectly, even completely devoid of the fear he was so used to seeing. Simon stared at her, his face a mask of profound confusion and rising panic. "Nora, what? What is this? Whose house is this? How are you doing this?" "This is my home, Simon," she replied, stepping out onto the expansive porch and closing the door behind her. "The one you so graciously gave me in the settlement. I put a little work into it." "You couldn't afford a new roof, let alone—" Simon gestured wildly at the magnificent estate, his voice cracking. "Where did you get the money? Who are you sleeping with? Did you hide assets during the divorce? Because if you did, I will tear you apart in court." Nora let out a soft, melodic laugh that cut Simon to the bone. "You always were incredibly predictable." "No, Simon, I didn't hide anything." "You did. You hid the Cayman accounts, the investment portfolios, the real estate. You took everything you possibly could, and you left me a worthless patch of dirt because you thought it was a brilliant, cruel joke." Nora stepped closer, her eyes flashing with triumphant fire. "But you were always a terrible investor, Simon. You never even bothered to inspect the land you bought. If you had, you might have found the reinforced concrete vault hidden beneath the root cellar. You might have found the $50 million in gold bullion bearer bonds and uncut diamonds that the previous owner left behind." All the color instantly drained from Simon's face. He physically staggered backward, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "No," he whispered, a pathetic, strangled sound escaping his throat. "No, that's impossible. That's mine. I bought that land." "You did." Nora agreed smoothly. "And then you legally signed away all rights to the property, including any subsequent discoveries or subsurface assets, in a legally binding arbitration settlement that your own lawyers drafted to screw me over. Harrison Reed made sure the language was ironclad. You gave it to me, Simon. All of it." Simon's knees literally buckled. He grabbed the thick cedar railing to keep from collapsing onto the heated stone porch. He had spent the last year burning his life to the ground, losing his business, his girlfriend, and his pristine reputation. And the whole time, the unimaginable fortune he desperately needed had been sitting under the floorboards of the rotting cabin he had used as a weapon against his wife. He had handed her the ultimate winning lottery ticket just to be petty. "I can sue," Simon gasped, tears of pure, agonizing regret welling in his eyes. "I can fight the settlement. I can take it to the Supreme Court." "You have no money to sue, Simon," Nora stated coldly, crossing her arms. "Your company is bankrupt. Your credit is completely destroyed. And even if you found a lawyer stupid enough to take this on contingency, my legal team has a war chest of $50 million to bury you in injunctions until the day you die. It is over. Nora turned her back on him and placed her hand on the heavy brass doorknob. "Please," Simon begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "Nora, please. I have absolutely nothing left. I'm going to lose my apartment next week. I have staggering debts. Just give me $1 million, a fraction of it. We were married for 10 years. Nora paused, looking over her shoulder. The empathy she had once felt for this man had been burned away a very long time ago in a sterile Chicago arbitration room. "You're right, Simon," she said softly, her voice carrying over the wind. "We were married, and the terms of our divorce were extremely generous. You got exactly what you negotiated for." She stepped inside and firmly shut the heavy oak door. The loud, solid click of the deadbolt echoed like a final gunshot in the quiet mountain air. Simon was left standing alone on the pristine porch, weeping into his hands, surrounded by the breathtaking, undeniable evidence of his own catastrophic greed. Nora walked to her expansive designer kitchen, poured herself a glass of expensive vintage wine, and looked out over the rolling Appalachian Mountains, the undisputed queen of an empire built on the ashes of her past. Did Nora's incredible discovery leave you speechless? This is only the beginning of her stunning revenge. In the next part, you won't believe how she legally secures the fortune under Simon's nose and his ultimate crushing reaction when he finds out what he threw away. If you loved this twist of fate, hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a great comeback, and subscribe so you don't miss the epic conclusion.